Picture this. You're standing in line at a crowded military base cafeteria. The atmosphere is thick with testosterone and pride. Suddenly, you witness a decorated Marine sergeant publicly humiliate what appears to be a quiet, unassuming woman in uniform. He pushes her, mocks her, and declares that she doesn't belong among real warriors. The entire cafeteria falls silent. Every eye is watching. Some laugh nervously. Others look uncomfortable. But no one intervenes. After all, this Marine has ribbons covering his chest and a reputation that precedes him. What happens next will shatter everything you think you know about strength, leadership, and the true meaning of courage. Because that quiet woman he just humiliated, she's about to reveal an identity so shocking, so completely opposite to his assumptions, that it will leave him questioning everything he believes about power and respect in the military. This isn't just another story about workplace harassment. This isn't about gender politics or military protocol. This is about the moment when arrogance meets reality, when assumptions collide with truth, and when one person's world gets turned completely upside down in front of hundreds of witnesses.
The woman he pushed didn't just outrank him.
She didn't just lead men into battle. She commanded the most elite fighting force in the world, a force so secret, so lethal, that even mentioning their operations could end careers. What you're about to read actually happened. The names have been changed, but the story remains exactly as it unfolded on that Tuesday afternoon in 2019, when Sergeant Mike Torres learned the hardest lesson of his military career.
Never judge a warrior by their appearance.
Are you ready to witness the moment that changed everything?
The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the Norfolk Naval Base cafeteria, casting their usual harsh white glow over rows of metal tables filled with service members grabbing quick lunches between duties.
It was Tuesday, March 12, 2019, and the afternoon rush was in full swing. The air was thick with the smell of institutional food and the constant chatter of military personnel discussing everything from weekend plans to deployment schedules. Commander Sarah Chen stood quietly in the lunch line, her slight frame barely noticeable among the sea of predominantly male service members. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, she had learned long ago to blend into the background when she wasn't in operational mode. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform was pristine but unremarkable.
To the casual observer, she looked like any other mid-level officer grabbing a quick bite.
What nobody in that cafeteria knew, except for a handful of people with the highest security clearances, was that Commander Chen had just returned from a classified operation in Syria, where she had led a team of Navy SEALs in a mission so sensitive that even the Pentagon brass only knew it by a code name.
For the past 18 months, she had been commanding SEAL Team 7's most elite unit, a position that made her one of fewer than 20 women in the entire world to hold such responsibility.
But today, she was just another face in the crowd. Exactly how she preferred it when she was stateside. 3 spots behind her in line stood Sergeant Mike Torres, a decorated Marine who had built his reputation on being exactly the opposite of subtle. At 6'2" and 220 pounds of muscle, Torres commanded attention wherever he went. His chest was a canvas of ribbons and commendations from 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and various smaller operations throughout the Middle East. His Bronze Star with Valor caught the light as he moved, and his combat action ribbon sat proudly among a dozen other decorations. Torres had earned every piece of metal on his uniform. He had pulled wounded Marines from burning vehicles under enemy fire. He had led successful raids on Taliban strongholds. He had trained dozens of younger Marines who looked up to him as the embodiment of what a warrior should be. In his mind, and in the minds of many who served with him, he represented the best of what the Marine Corps had to offer.
Unfortunately, Torres also carried with him the kind of old-school military attitudes that had been slowly but persistently challenged over the past 2 decades.
He believed in tradition and hierarchy based on battlefield experience, and in the idea that combat arms should remain the exclusive domain of those physically built for it. He wasn't malicious in his thinking, just said in ways that had served him well for 15 years of military service. The lunch line moved slowly, typical for the noon rush. Chen checked her watch, discreetly. She had a secure briefing at 1400 hours with Admiral Morrison about the Syria operations classified after-action report. The mission had been a complete success, but there were political implications that needed to be discussed at the highest levels. 3 high-value targets had been eliminated with 0 American casualties, and intelligence gathered during the operation had already prevented 2 terrorist attacks in Europe. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, Isis wanted to grab a sandwich and find a quiet corner to eat before her next meeting. Torres, meanwhile, was holding court with two younger Marines who had somehow managed to get lunch duty at the same time. Corporals Jackson and Martinez hung on his every word as he recounted a firefight from his last deployment, his voice carrying easily over the ambient noise of the cafeteria. So there we were, 3 clicks from the LZ, and these Hagies start lighting us up from a compound about 400 meters out, Torres was saying, his hands moving to illustrate the tactical situation. I told my boys to lay down suppressing fire while I flanked left with Johnson and Stevens. Classic fire and maneuver, just like they teach you at SOI, but the real deal this time.
Jackson, barely 19 and fresh from infantry school, absorbed every word like gospel. Martinez, a little older and with 1 deployment under his belt, nodded appreciatively at the tactical details.
This was exactly the kind of real-world experience they hoped to gain from veterans like Torres.
Did you call in air support, Sergeant? Jackson asked.
Hell no, Torres laughed, the sound carrying across several nearby tables. We handled our business like Marines should. No need for flyboys when you've got good Marines with rifles. 15 minutes later, compound was secure, 5 enemy KIA, and we didn't lose a single Marine. The story continued as the line inched forward, Torres's voice growing slightly louder with each tactical detail. Other service members nearby couldn't help but listen in, some nodding with approval at the described tactics, others simply enjoying the entertainment value of a well-told war story. Chen found herself listening despite her intention to stay focused on her own thoughts. The story was actually quite good, she had to admit. Torres clearly knew his business when it came to small unit tactics, and his leadership in that situation had probably saved lives. She could appreciate competent military leadership, regardless of the source. What she couldn't appreciate was the slight edge of superiority in Torres's voice when he made comments about real combat and how Marines handle business. There was an implication in his tone that suggested other branches, other types of operations, other kinds of service members weren't quite measuring up to his standard of what military service should look like. Still, Chen had heard worse, and she had learned long ago to pick her battles carefully. As one of the most senior female officers in special operations, she had developed thick skin and an ability to separate professional competence from personal attitudes. Torres might have some outdated ideas, but he was clearly a competent combat leader, and that counted for something in her book. The lunch line continued its slow progression toward the serving counter. The cafeteria staff, a mix of military personnel on temporary assignment and civilian contractors, worked efficiently to keep the food moving. Today's menu featured the usual selection of options designed to feed large numbers of people quickly and affordably. Nothing fancy, but nutritionally adequate and reasonably tasty for institutional food. Chen finally reached the serving counter and quickly selected a turkey sandwich, a bag of chips, and a bottle of water. She paid without comment and began looking for a place to sit.
Does the doctor have any context under page 2?
The cafeteria was crowded with most tables full or nearly full. She spotted a half-empty table near the back corner, perfect for reviewing her notes before the afternoon briefing. As she walked toward the table, balancing her tray carefully, Torres reached the serving counter behind her. He was still regaling his audience with details from various deployments, his voice carrying clearly through the busy cafeteria. Other Marines and sailors nearby were starting to pay attention to his stories, some gathering closer to listen. The thing you've got to understand, Torres was saying as he loaded his tray with enough food for 2 people, is that when things get real, when bullets start flying and people start dying, you find out real quick who belongs on the battlefield and who doesn't.
Chen paused for just a moment, her hand tightening slightly on her tray.
That particular comment struck a nerve, not because it was directed at her specifically, but because she had heard variations of it throughout her career. The implication was always the same. Real combat was for a certain type of person, and anyone who didn't fit the traditional image of a warrior was somehow less capable, less committed, less worthy of respect. She continued toward her chosen table, determined not to let old prejudices ruin her lunch break. But Torres wasn't finished with his commentary.
I mean, don't get me wrong,
He continued, his voice growing slightly louder as he warmed to his subject. Everyone's got their place in the military. Support personnel, admin types, even some of these women they're putting in combat roles now. But when you're talking about real fighting, about taking the fight to the enemy and bringing everyone home alive, that's when you need real warriors. The conversation around Torres had grown, with several other service members now listening with varying degrees of agreement or discomfort. Some nodded along with his assertions, while others looked less certain about where the discussion was heading. Chen reached her table and set down her tray, trying to focus on her upcoming briefing rather than the increasingly problematic commentary behind her. She had more important things to think about than one Marine's outdated opinions about military service. But Torres wasn't done talking. and his next comment would change everything.
"Look at that," he said, gesturing in Chen's direction as she arranged her lunch on the table.
Perfect example of what I'm talking about. Nice enough lady, I'm sure, but do you really think someone like that could lead Marines in combat? Could make the hard decisions when lives are on the line? I mean, come on. The cafeteria seemed to grow quieter around Torres, though he didn't seem to notice the change in atmosphere. Several service members looked uncomfortable with the direction his comments had taken, but none of them spoke up to challenge him. Chen felt every eye in her section of the cafeteria turn toward her. She sat perfectly still, her sandwich halfway to her mouth as she processed what had just happened. In 15 years of military service, including some of the most dangerous special operations missions in modern military history, she had faced enemy fire, political bureaucracy, and institutional prejudice with equal composure. But this was different. This was personal, public, and completely unprofessional. More importantly, it was happening in front of dozens of service members who would judge her response carefully. How she handled this moment would be remembered and discussed long after lunch was over. She set down her sandwich and turned slowly in her chair to face Torres, who was still holding court near the serving counter. The movement was deliberate and calm, the kind of controlled motion that comes from extensive training in high-stress situations. Torres, meanwhile, was just getting started with his analysis of modern military standards and the people who met them. He had no idea that he had just publicly challenged one of the most lethal and decorated officers in the United States military. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary within Norfolk Naval Base and eventually throughout the entire special operations community. But in that moment, as Chen rose from her seat and Torres continued his commentary, nobody could have predicted just how dramatically the next few minutes would unfold. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, the cafeteria staff continued serving lunch, and dozens of service members held their collective breath as two very different kinds of warriors prepared to meet. Commander Sarah Chen stood up from her table with the kind of fluid, controlled movement that spoke of years of physical training and combat experience. Every eye in her section of the cafeteria was now focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to Sergeant Torres's public dismissal of her capabilities. The ambient noise of conversation and clinking silverware seemed to fade into background static as the tension ratcheted up several notches. Torres, still oblivious to the brewing storm, continued his monologue to his growing audience of Marines and sailors. He had moved away from the serving counter and was now standing near the center of the seating area, his broad frame commanding attention as he gestured expansively with his hands. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Torres declared, his voice carrying easily through the increasingly quiet cafeteria. "The military's gotten soft? We're more worried about political correctness than battlefield effectiveness. Back in my day, you proved yourself in combat before anyone took you seriously. Now they're handing out leadership positions like participation trophies." Corporal Jackson shifted uncomfortably beside his sergeant, sensing that the conversation was taking a turn that might not end well. He had noticed the small woman at the back table stand up, and something about her posture suggested she wasn't planning to ignore Torres's comments. Martinez, the more experienced of the two corporals, was already taking a small step backward, his survival instincts warning him that trouble was coming. Chen began walking toward Torres with measured steps, her face a mask of professional calm. She had learned long ago that emotional reactions in situations like this only validated the prejudices of people like Torres. Better to let actions speak louder than words. As she moved through the tables, other service members instinctively shifted to give her a clear path, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Sergeant Torres," Chen said as she approached, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with crystal clarity. She pitched her tone to carry throughout the immediate area without shouting, a technique she had perfected during countless briefings in hostile environments. "I believe you were making some observations about military leadership and combat effectiveness." Torres turned toward the voice, expecting to see another officer preparing to lecture him about sensitivity or appropriate workplace behavior. What he saw instead was the small woman from the back table standing about 10 feet away with her hands clasped loosely behind her back in a perfect parade rest position. Her posture was relaxed but somehow intimidating, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. "Ma'am," Torres said, his tone shifting slightly as he recognized that he was now dealing with an officer rather than just another enlisted person he could dismiss. Military courtesy demanded a certain level of respect, regardless of his personal opinions.
"I was just sharing some thoughts with my Marines here about leadership and combat experience. I heard," Chen replied, taking another step closer, "you suggested that someone like me couldn't lead Marines in combat or make hard decisions when lives are on the line."
"I'm curious about what you base that assessment on, given that we've never met and you know nothing about my background or experience."
The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter as more people became aware of the unfolding confrontation.
Service members at nearby tables stopped their conversations to listen, while others craned their necks to get a better view of what was happening. The cafeteria staff behind the serving counter paused in their duties, sensing the drama that was building in their dining area. Torres felt a flicker of uncertainty as he looked at the woman standing before him. There was something in her eyes, something in the way she carried herself, that didn't match his assumptions about who she was or what she represented. This is also common, but he had already committed to his position in front of his Marines and a growing audience, and backing down now would damage his reputation and authority. With all due respect, ma'am, Torres said, his voice taking on the slightly condescending tone that military personnel sometimes used when they felt cornered but couldn't directly challenge a superior officer. I base my assessment on 15 years of combat experience in some of the worst hellholes on this planet. I've led Marines through more firefights than I can count, and I've seen what it takes to bring everyone home alive. Chen nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his response carefully. 15 years is impressive, Sergeant. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, plus various smaller operations throughout the Middle East.
Bronze Star with Valor for pulling wounded Marines from a burning vehicle under enemy fire near Ramadi in 2016. Combat Action Ribbon, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V, Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds received during a Taliban ambush in Helmand Province.
Torres's eyes widened in surprise. The woman had just recited his service record with perfect accuracy, including details that weren't common knowledge even among his fellow Marines. "How do you know all that?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly as his confidence began to waver.
I make it my business to know about the people I serve with, Chen replied calmly. Just like I know that Corporal Jackson here graduated 3rd in his infantry school class and has been assigned to your unit for exactly 6 weeks.
And Corporal Martinez earned his Combat Action Ribbon during the evacuation of the American Embassy in Sudan last year, where he showed exceptional courage under fire. Both young Marines straightened unconsciously at the mention of their names and service records. They had no idea who this officer was, but her knowledge of their backgrounds was both impressive and slightly unsettling. Torres was now completely off balance, trying to figure out how this seemingly insignificant woman knew so much about him and his Marines. His initial assumptions were crumbling rapidly, but he was too committed to his position to back down gracefully. "That's all well and good, ma'am," he said, his voice betraying a hint of defensive anger. "But knowing someone's service record from a computer file is different from actually leading people in combat. With respect, you look like you'd have trouble carrying a full combat load, much less making life-and-death decisions for a unit under fire."
The insult hung in the air like a live grenade.
Several service members gasped audibly, while others shook their heads in disbelief that Torres had just directly challenged a superior officer's combat credentials in such a public and personal manner. Even his own Marines looked mortified at their sergeant's breach of military courtesy. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere around her. The relaxed professionalism was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more dangerous. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new edge that made several nearby service members unconsciously straighten in their seats.
"You're absolutely right, Sergeant,"
she said, taking another step closer to Torres.
"Knowing someone's service record is very different from actually leading people in combat."
So let me share some of my actual experience with you. She paused for a moment, letting the tension build as she considered exactly how much classified information she could reveal without violating operational security.
There was a lot she couldn't say, but there was plenty she could share that would make her point effectively. 6 months ago, I led a team of 12 men through a nighttime infiltration of a heavily defended compound in eastern Syria, she began, her voice taking on the clinical tone of an after-action report.
The target was a high-value ISIS commander who had been planning attacks on American soil. Intelligence indicated the compound was defended by at least 30 enemy combatants with military training in heavy weapons.
Torres opened his mouth to respond, but Chen continued without pause, her gaze locked on his eyes with unwavering intensity. "My team approached through a wadi system that required us to low crawl for over 2 kilometers through mud and sewage water."
Each man was carrying over 60 pounds of equipment, including specialized breaching charges, night vision equipment, and enough ammunition for a sustained firefight. The approach took 4 hours in complete darkness, with enemy patrols passing within 50 meters of our position 3 times. The cafeteria had fallen completely silent now. Even the staff behind the serving counter had stopped working to listen to what sounded like a classified briefing being delivered at the volume of normal conversation. When we reached the compound perimeter, We had exactly 17 minutes to complete the mission before enemy reinforcements arrived from a nearby military base. Chen continued. I made the decision to split the team into 3 elements, with one creating a diversion at the main gate while the other 2 breached from opposite sides of the compound. Torres was staring at her now with a mixture of confusion and growing realization. The level of tactical detail she was providing, the casual way she discussed classified operations, and the complete confidence in her voice were beginning to paint a very different picture than his initial assumptions had suggested. The breach was successful, but we immediately came under heavy fire from prepared positions, Chen said, her voice never wavering from its professional tone. I had to make a split-second decision to call in danger close air support while half my team was still inside the compound. The margin for error was less than 50 meters, and any mistake would have killed my own people. She paused again, letting the implications of that decision sink in.
Calling in danger close air support was one of the most difficult and dangerous decisions any combat leader could make, requiring absolute precision and nerves of steel. The airstrike eliminated the defensive positions, my team secured the target and valuable intelligence materials, and we extracted with 0 casualties, she concluded.
Mission time from infiltration to extraction was 6 hours and 43 minutes. The intelligence we gathered prevented 2 terrorist attacks in Germany and 1 in France. Torres was now staring at her with his mouth slightly open. His previous confidence completely evaporated. The woman standing in front of him had just described a special operations mission of extraordinary complexity and danger, led with the kind of tactical expertise that came only from years of elite training and combat experience. But she wasn't finished with her demonstration. 3 months before that, Chen continued, I led a team of 8 men in a hostage rescue operation in Somalia. American aid workers had been taken by pirates, and intelligence indicated they would be killed within 24 hours if we didn't act.
What shall they give to this terroristic safety?
The compound was in the middle of a city controlled by hostile forces, surrounded by civilians, and defended by an unknown number of enemy combatants. Torres felt his stomach beginning to sink as he realized exactly what kind of person he had just publicly challenged and insulted. These weren't stories from training exercises or routine patrols. These were descriptions of the most elite and dangerous special operations missions that the American military conducted.
We inserted by fast rope from helicopters at 0300 hours in the middle of a sandstorm that reduced visibility to less than 10 meters, Chen said, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone who had briefed these operations dozens of times. I had to navigate through a maze of narrow streets while coordinating with Overwatch snipers, close air support, and a quick reaction force standing by for emergency extraction.
The entire cafeteria was hanging on every word now, as if they were listening to a Hollywood action movie being described by someone who had actually lived it. We reached the compound, neutralized 6 enemy combatants, and secured 3 American hostages without a single civilian casualty, Chen concluded. Total mission time was 47 minutes from insertion to extraction. All hostages were returned to their families safely. Torres stood frozen in place, his face pale as the full implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. This woman wasn't just some administrative officer or support personnel he could dismiss. She was describing special operations missions that only the most elite units in the American military were capable of conducting. But Chen still had one more revelation that would completely shatter his worldview. The silence in the cafeteria was now so complete that the only sounds were the humming of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of aircraft from the nearby airfield. Every person within earshot was staring at the unfolding confrontation between the decorated Marine sergeant and the small woman who had just described special operations missions with the casual precision of someone who had lived them.
Commander Sarah Chen looked at Sergeant Torres with an expression that somehow managed to be both understanding and deeply disappointed. She had seen that look of dawning realization on faces before, usually when prejudices and assumptions collided with reality in the most uncomfortable possible way.
You know, Sergeant,
she said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its authority, I actually respect what you've accomplished in your career. 15 years of service, multiple combat deployments, Marines who look up to you and trust your leadership. That means something, and I don't discount it. Torres stood motionless, his previous confidence completely shattered as he tried to process what he had just heard. The tactical details Chen had shared were far beyond anything he had experienced in his conventional infantry operations. The level of complexity, the split-second decision-making, the coordination of multiple elements under extreme pressure, these were descriptions of missions that only the most elite special operations forces conducted. But here's what you need to understand, Chen continued, taking one final step closer to Torres so that she was well within his personal space.
When you make assumptions about people based on their appearance, When you dismiss their capabilities without knowing anything about their background or experience, you don't just insult them.
You make yourself and every Marine you represent look ignorant and unprofessional. Corporal Jackson and Corporal Martinez had backed away several more steps, both young Marines desperately wishing they could disappear entirely from this rapidly deteriorating situation. Jackson, in particular, was beginning to understand that his sergeant had just made a catastrophic error in judgment, though he wasn't yet sure exactly how catastrophic. Chen reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small black wallet. She opened it slowly and held it up so that Torres could see the identification card inside. His eyes focused on the card, and what he saw there made his face go completely white. The ID identified the woman standing in front of him as Commander Sarah Chen, United States Navy. But more importantly, it showed her assigned unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DEN GRU. The organization that most people knew by its former name, SEAL Team 6. Torres felt his knees go weak as the full implications hit him like a physical blow. DEVGRU was the most elite special operations unit in the American military, more secretive and selective than even Delta Force.
They conducted the most dangerous and sensitive missions that the United States government authorized, operations so classified that their existence was rarely acknowledged publicly, and the woman he had just insulted and dismissed was not only a member of that unit, but based on her rank and the authority with which she had described those missions, she was clearly in a leadership position within it.
"Oh, God," Torres whispered, his voice barely audible as he stared at the identification card.
"Oh, my God."
But Chen wasn't finished with her revelation. She closed the wallet and returned it to her pocket, then looked Torres directly in the eyes with an expression that was somehow both compassionate and absolutely merciless.
What you also need to understand, Sergeant, is that the 12 men I led through that compound in Syria.
The 8 men I led on the hostage rescue in Somalia? They weren't just any special operations personnel, she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a briefing to senior military leadership.
They were Navy SEALs, Sergeant Torres.
Some of the most elite warriors in the world, men who had proven themselves in dozens of previous operations, men who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments the military had to offer.
And they followed my orders without question, not because they had to, but because they trusted my judgment and my ability to bring them home alive.
Torres was now visibly shaking, the full magnitude of his error becoming crystal clear. He had not only insulted a superior officer, he had publicly challenged the combat credentials of someone who commanded the respect of the most elite fighting force in the world. Those SEALs, Chen continued, men who could probably bench press twice their body weight and run a marathon in under 3 hours. Men who had been through some of the most grueling training the military has to offer, looked to me for leadership when their lives were on the line.
And they're still alive today because I made the right decisions when it mattered most.
The weight of her words settled over the cafeteria like a heavy blanket. Service members who had been listening to the confrontation were now looking at Torres with expressions ranging from sympathy to outright disgust.
His public humiliation was complete, but Chen still had more to say.
You asked if someone like me could make hard decisions when lives are on the line,
she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Let me tell you about some of the decisions I've had to make, Sergeant. She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts and considering how much she could reveal without compromising operational security. 2 years ago, I had to choose between completing a mission to eliminate a terrorist cell and attempting to rescue a wounded SEAL who had been separated from the team during a firefight. She began. The mission timeline was critical. Intelligence indicated the targets would be gone within the hour, and attempting a rescue would almost certainly compromise our position and possibly cost more lives.
Torres was now staring at her with a mixture of horror and fascination, like someone watching a car accident unfold in slow motion.
I made the decision to split the team, sent half to complete the primary mission while I led the other half to recover our wounded teammate, Chen continued. We found him bleeding out from multiple gunshot wounds, surrounded by enemy fighters who were using him as bait to draw us into an ambush.
The cafeteria was so quiet that people were holding their breath, waiting to hear how the story would end. I called in precision airstrikes to neutralize the enemy positions, coordinated medical evacuation under fire, and successfully completed both the primary mission and the rescue operation, she said. The terrorist cell was eliminated, preventing an attack on a military convoy that would have killed dozens of American soldiers. And my SEAL was back on active duty within 6 months.
She let that sink in for a moment, watching Torres's face as he processed the complexity and pressure of the decisions she routinely made.
6 months ago, I had to authorize the use of experimental breaching charges on a building that intelligence suggested might contain chemical weapons, she continued.
The margin for error was microscopic, because if the charges triggered a chemical release, it would have killed not only my team but potentially hundreds of civilians in the surrounding area.
Torres was now leaning against a nearby table for support, his face pale and his hands visibly trembling.
I made the decision based on incomplete information, under extreme time pressure, with the lives of my team and innocent civilians hanging in the balance, Chen said.
The breach was successful. We secured the facility and discovered that the chemical weapons had been moved weeks earlier, but my team and those civilians are alive today because I made the right call with the information I had. She moved even closer to Torres, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, but still carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria. Last year, I had to choose between following direct orders from senior command and what I knew was the right tactical decision based on real-time intelligence from the battlefield, she said. The orders called for a frontal assault on a compound that new intelligence revealed was heavily fortified with civilian shields. Following those orders would have completed the mission but resulted in significant civilian casualties.
Torres was now barely breathing, completely overwhelmed by the weight of the decisions this woman routinely made.
I made the call to disobey direct orders and execute an alternative plan that took longer, was more dangerous for my team, but would minimize civilian casualties, she concluded. The mission was successful, no civilians were harmed, and I spent 3 weeks in front of a board of inquiry explaining my decision to generals who had never been closer to combat than a Pentagon briefing room.
She stepped back slightly, giving Torres some space to process what he had just heard. So when you ask if someone like me can make hard decisions when lives are on the line, Sergeant Torres, the answer is that I've been making those decisions almost daily for the past 5 years, she said. Decisions that affect not just the lives of my team members but national security, international relations, and the safety of civilian populations. Torres finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Ma'am, I had no idea. I'm sorry, Chen held up a hand to stop his stammered apology. You had no idea because you made assumptions based on my appearance instead of taking the time to learn anything about who I actually am or what I've accomplished, she said. That's not just ignorance, Sergeant. It's dangerous. She looked around the cafeteria, making eye contact with several of the service members who had been listening to the entire confrontation. In special operations, we have a saying, the deadliest enemies are often the ones you least expect, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent dining area. The terrorist who looks like a harmless old man. The building that appears empty but is filled with explosives. The quiet woman who turns out to be one of the most lethal operators in the United States military. She turned her attention back to Torres, who was still struggling to process the complete collapse of his worldview.
Your assumptions about me could have gotten people killed if we were in a combat situation and you had dismissed my tactical input or refused to follow my orders based on those assumptions, she said. In the real world, Sergeant, arrogance and prejudice are luxuries that professional warriors can't afford.
Torres was now fully understanding the magnitude of his error, not just in terms of military courtesy and professional behavior, but in terms of his fundamental approach to evaluating people and their capabilities. But Commander Chen had one final revelation that would completely reshape his understanding of military leadership and what it meant to be a true warrior. Commander Sarah Chen looked at the devastated Marine sergeant standing before her and felt a mixture of disappointment and genuine sympathy. She had seen this moment of realization before, usually when well-meaning but misguided service members had their preconceptions shattered by reality. It was never pleasant to witness, but it was often necessary for growth and learning. Sergeant Torres, she said, her voice softening slightly, I want you to understand that I'm not telling you all of this to humiliate you or to prove that I'm somehow superior to you. The truth is, what you've accomplished in your career is genuinely impressive, and the Marines you've led and trained are better warriors because of your leadership. Torres looked up at her with confusion and surprise. Social media and journalists are trying to satisfy yourself a certain event. After the thorough dismantling of his assumptions and the revelation of her true identity and capabilities, he had expected continued humiliation, not anything resembling understanding or respect. But what you need to learn from this experience, Chen continued, is that military excellence comes in many different forms, and true leadership requires the wisdom to recognize and respect those differences. She gestured toward Corporal Jackson and Corporal Martinez, who were still standing nearby looking like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Your Marines there are watching how you handle this situation, Sergeant. They're learning from your example. Just like they learned from your combat stories and tactical expertise, what you do next will teach them more about leadership and character than any war story you could tell them. Torres glanced at his two Marines and saw the truth in Chen's words. Jackson and Martinez were indeed watching him carefully,
and how he responded to this complete reversal of fortune would shape their understanding of what it meant to be a professional warrior. "Ma'am," Torres said, his voice shaky but sincere, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions that were completely wrong, and I said things that were unprofessional and disrespectful. There's no excuse for that." Chen nodded approvingly. "That's a good start, Sergeant. But I want you to understand exactly what those assumptions cost you."
And what they could cost in a real operational environment.
She looked around the cafeteria, which was still silent and focused entirely on their conversation. Every service member within earshot was getting an impromptu lesson in leadership, respect, and the dangers of prejudice.
3 months ago, Chen began, I was conducting a pre-mission briefing for a joint operation involving Marine Force Reconnaissance, Army Rangers, and my SEAL team. The mission was to eliminate a terrorist training camp that was preparing fighters for attacks on American bases in the region.
Torres straightened slightly, recognizing that she was about to share another operational example, but this time one that directly involved Marines like himself. The Marine Force Recon team was led by a gunnery sergeant who had an impressive record, very similar to yours. Chen continued, multiple combat deployments, decorations for valor, respected by his men. But when he saw me walk into the briefing room, his first reaction was to ask who had sent the Navy admin officer to observe the briefing. Torres winced, recognizing himself in that description.
I politely corrected him and explained that I would be leading the overall operation, Chen said. His response was to suggest that perhaps the mission would be better served with a more experienced special operations officer in command. He recommended that one of his Marine officers take point on the operation. The parallels to Torres's own behavior were becoming painfully obvious, and he could see where the story was heading.
I gave him the same kind of background information that I shared with you today, Chen continued. Operational history, mission success rates, the confidence that SEAL teams had placed in my leadership.
But unlike you, Sergeant, he refused to accept that information. He continued to insist that Marines should lead Marines, and that special operations were too important to be left to anyone who wasn't proven in his specific type of combat. Torres felt his stomach sinking as he anticipated the conclusion of this story. The gunny made his objections known through the chain of command. Chen said, he requested that the operation be redesigned with Marine leadership based on his assessment that my background and experience were insufficient for the mission requirements. She paused, letting the tension build as service members throughout the cafeteria waited to hear what had happened next.
His request was denied, obviously, but the damage was already done, she continued. During the mission, at a critical moment when split-second coordination between all 3 units was essential, that gunnery sergeant hesitated to follow my tactical commands because he still didn't trust my judgment. Torres was now completely focused on Chen's words, understanding that he was hearing about the real-world consequences of the exact attitude he had displayed just minutes earlier. That hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds, Chen said, her voice taking on a harder edge.
But 3 seconds in combat can be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, between everyone coming home alive and writing letters to families. The cafeteria seemed to grow even quieter, if that was possible, as the gravity of what she was describing sank in. Because of that moment of hesitation, the Marine element was slightly out of position when the enemy response came. Chen continued, they were exposed to crossfire from a position that should have been neutralized by then. 2 Marines were wounded, one seriously, because their leader couldn't set aside his prejudices long enough to trust the tactical judgment of someone who looked different from what he expected.
Torres felt like he had been punched in the stomach. The idea that his kind of thinking could lead to Marines being wounded or killed in combat was almost too much to process.
Both Marines survived, Chen added quickly, seeing the stricken expression on Torres's face. But they didn't have to be wounded at all. Their injuries, their pain, their family's anguish, the months of recovery and rehabilitation, all of that happened because one Marine leader couldn't accept that military excellence doesn't always look the way he expected it to.
She let that sink in for a moment before delivering her final point.
That gunnery sergeant was relieved of command and reassigned to a training position, she said, not because he wasn't a good Marine or a capable leader, but because his inability to work effectively with diverse leadership made him a liability in joint operations. His career effectively ended because he couldn't learn the lesson you're learning right now. Torres was now openly struggling with the implications of everything he had heard. His entire worldview about military leadership and combat effectiveness was crumbling, replaced by a much more complex and nuanced understanding of what it meant to be a professional warrior. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper,
I could have been that gunny.
If we had been in a combat situation, if I had been serving under your command, my attitude could have gotten people killed. Chen nodded soberly.
Yes, Sergeant, it could have.
And that's why this conversation is so important, not just for you, but for everyone who's listening to it.
She looked around the cafeteria again, making eye contact with service members who had been following every word of the exchange.
Military effectiveness isn't about how much you can bench press or how intimidating you look in uniform, she said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the dining area. It's about tactical knowledge, decision-making under pressure, the ability to inspire confidence in the people you lead, and the wisdom to accomplish the mission while minimizing casualties. She turned back to Torres, her expression showing both firmness and compassion.
You want to know what real military leadership looks like, Sergeant?
It looks like setting aside your ego and preconceptions long enough to evaluate people based on their actual capabilities, rather than your assumptions about what those capabilities should look like.
Torres straightened up, some of his natural bearing returning as he processed the lesson he had been given.
It looks like being willing to learn from anyone who has knowledge or experience that can make you and your Marines better warriors, Chen continued. And it looks like having the courage to admit when you've made a mistake, and taking steps to ensure you don't make that mistake again.
She extended her hand toward Torres, a gesture that surprised him and everyone else who was watching.
The question now, Sergeant, is what you're going to do with what you've learned today, she said. Are you going to let this experience make you bitter and defensive, or are you going to use it to become a better leader for the Marines who depend on you? Torres looked at her extended hand for a moment, then reached out and shook it firmly.
The gesture felt symbolic, like he was accepting not just her forgiveness, but also a new understanding of what military professionalism really meant. Ma'am, he said, his voice stronger now, I want to be better. I want to learn from this, and I want to make sure my Marines never make the same mistakes I made today. Fine man shall make sense, do the same thing that Charleston shares. Chen smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun, a genuine expression of approval and encouragement.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear, Sergeant, she said.
And that attitude, that willingness to grow and change, that's what separates good leaders from great ones. But as their handshake ended and it seemed like the confrontation might be winding down, Chen realized there was one more lesson that Torres and everyone else in that cafeteria needed to hear.
The most important lesson of all about what it really meant to serve something greater than yourself.
The fluorescent lights continued to hum overhead, but the atmosphere in the cafeteria had completely changed.
What had started as a moment of public humiliation was transforming into something much more valuable, a teaching moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Commander Sarah Chen released Sergeant Torres's hand and took a small step back, but she didn't move away from him entirely.
She could see in his eyes that he was genuinely processing what had happened, genuinely trying to learn from the experience, rather than simply waiting for the humiliation to end so he could escape.
Sergeant, she said, her voice taking on the tone of a senior officer providing guidance rather than delivering a reprimand. I want to share one more thing with you, and I want everyone here to understand this clearly. The cafeteria remained silent, with service members throughout the dining area still focused intently on the conversation. What had started as a confrontation between two individuals had evolved into an impromptu leadership seminar that everyone present would remember for the rest of their military careers.
The most important thing you can learn from today isn't about respecting women in the military or being politically correct or avoiding assumptions about people's capabilities. Chen began. Those things matter, but they're not the core issue. Torres listened carefully, sensing that she was building towards something important. The core issue is about understanding what the military is really for, and what our job is as military leaders, she continued.
We don't serve to prove how tough we are or to validate our own egos, or to maintain traditions that make us feel comfortable. We serve to protect people who can't protect themselves, to preserve freedoms that others take for granted, and to ensure that America remains strong enough to defend its values and interests around the world. She looked around the cafeteria, making eye contact with service members of various ranks and branches, ensuring that her words reached everyone present. When we let personal prejudices or outdated assumptions interfere with our ability to work with the best people available for a mission, we're not just being unfair to individuals, she said. We're potentially compromising national security, putting American lives at risk, and failing in our fundamental duty to serve something larger than ourselves. Torres nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader implications of the lesson he was receiving.
Every person in this room took an oath when they joined the military, Chen continued.
We swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
We didn't swear to support and defend our own prejudices, our comfort zones, or our traditional ways of thinking.
She moved slightly so that she could address the entire cafeteria more directly, transforming the space into an informal classroom. The enemies we face today don't care about our gender, our race, our background, or what we look like in uniform, she said. They care about our capabilities, our determination, and our ability to work together as an effective fighting force. When we underestimate each other based on surface characteristics, we make ourselves weaker and we make our enemies' jobs easier. Corporal Jackson, who had been listening to every word with the intensity of someone receiving crucial life lessons, raised his hand tentatively. Chen noticed the gesture and nodded for him to speak. "Ma'am," Jackson said, his voice uncertain but sincere, "how do we know when we're making assumptions about people? Sometimes you think you're just being realistic about what someone can or can't do." It was an excellent question, and Chen was pleased that one of the younger Marines was engaged enough to ask it publicly. "That's a very good question, Corporal," she said. "The answer is that you test your assumptions against reality, rather than just accepting them as truth. You look at actual performance, actual results, actual capabilities rather than making judgments based on what you think those capabilities should be." She gestured toward Torres as an example. "Sergeant Torres here made assumptions about my capabilities based on my physical appearance and his preconceptions about what a combat leader should look like," she explained. "He didn't bother to find out about my actual background, my actual experience, or my actual track record. He made a judgment based on incomplete information and personal bias." Torres shifted uncomfortably but didn't disagree with her characterization.
The professional approach would have been to evaluate my leadership based on results, Chen continued. How do the people I lead perform?
What's my mission success rate? Do the people under my command trust my judgment and follow my orders effectively? Those are the metrics that actually matter in military leadership. Corporal Martinez, emboldened by his colleague's question, also raised his hand. Chen nodded for him to speak. "Ma'am, what should we do if we realize we've been making those kinds of assumptions about people?" he asked. Chen smiled approvingly at the question. These young Marines were clearly taking the lesson seriously and trying to apply it to their own development as leaders.
Just taking no time and attention to recognize an indulgence in a heart standard.
The first step is acknowledging that you've made a mistake, just like Sergeant Torres did a few minutes ago, she said. It takes courage to admit that your thinking has been wrong, especially when that admission comes with professional and personal consequences. She looked directly at Torres, who met her gaze steadily. The second step is taking concrete action to change your behavior and your thinking, she continued. That means actively seeking out information about people's actual capabilities, rather than relying on assumptions. It means giving people opportunities to prove themselves based on merit rather than dismissing them based on preconceptions. Torres cleared his throat, indicating that he wanted to contribute to the conversation. Chen nodded for him to speak. "Ma'am," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the confrontation began, "I want my Marines to learn from my mistake. I want them to understand that what happened here today could have had serious consequences if we had been in a real operational situation." Chen nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude, Sergeant. Leadership is about setting an example, and sometimes the most powerful example you can set is showing how to handle it when you realize you've been wrong about something important."
She turned to address Jackson and Martinez directly.
You two have been given a gift today, she said. You've seen what happens when prejudice and assumptions meet reality, and you've seen how a professional responds when they realize they've made a serious error in judgment.
Most people don't get to learn these lessons in a safe environment where the only cost is temporary embarrassment. Jackson nodded seriously.
Yes, ma'am.
"I won't forget what happened here today." "Ma'am," Martinez added, "is there anything specific we should do to make sure we don't make the same mistakes?" Chen considered the question carefully. These young Marines were clearly sincere in their desire to learn and grow, and she wanted to give them practical advice they could actually implement. "Start by questioning your first impressions of people," she said. "When you meet someone new, especially in a professional context, ask yourself what assumptions you're making about their capabilities, and what those assumptions are based on. Are you evaluating them based on actual evidence, or are you just going with what feels familiar or comfortable?"
She paused to let that sink in before continuing.
Second, make an effort to learn about people's actual backgrounds and experience before making judgments about what they can or can't do.
Military service records are usually accessible, and most people are happy to share their experiences if you ask respectfully. Torres was listening as intently as his Marines, clearly determined to absorb every lesson available from this experience.
Third, Chen continued, remember that military effectiveness comes in many different forms. The skills required for special operations are different from the skills required for conventional infantry, which are different from the skills required for logistics or intelligence or any other military specialty.
Excellence in one area doesn't automatically translate to excellence in another, and weakness in one area doesn't negate strength in others.
She looked around the cafeteria one more time, ensuring that her final point would reach everyone present.
But most importantly, she said, remember that our job as military professionals is to accomplish the mission and take care of our people. Everything else, our egos, our comfort zones, our traditional ways of thinking, is secondary to those fundamental responsibilities.
Torres straightened to attention, his Marine training taking over as he prepared to make a formal statement. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cafeteria, "I want to publicly apologize for my unprofessional behavior and my disrespectful comments.
I made assumptions that were wrong, and I said things that were inappropriate.
I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'm committed to learning from this experience and becoming a better leader for my Marines."
The formal apology was exactly what Chen had hoped to hear, but she could see that Torres genuinely meant it rather than just going through the motions. "Apology accepted, Sergeant," she said with equal formality.
And I want everyone here to understand that Sergeant Torres has demonstrated exactly the kind of character and professionalism that the Marine Corps represents at its best.
It takes courage to admit a mistake publicly, and it takes integrity to commit to change.
She moved closer to Torres and lowered her voice slightly, speaking directly to him but still loud enough for others to hear. "You're going to be a better leader because of what happened today, Sergeant. Your Marines are going to benefit from the lesson you learned, and they're going to respect you more for how you handled it when you realized you were wrong." Torres nodded, some of his natural confidence returning as he processed her words. "Ma'am," he said, "would it be possible? I mean, would you be willing to share some of your tactical knowledge with my Marines sometime? I think they could learn a lot from someone with your operational experience."
The request surprised Chen, but it also pleased her. Torres was demonstrating that he had truly internalized the lesson about learning from anyone who had valuable knowledge to share.
"I'd be honored to do that, Sergeant," she replied. "Combat experience should be shared across service lines whenever possible."
We're all on the same team, working toward the same goals.
As their conversation wound down, Chen became aware that the normal sounds of the cafeteria were beginning to return. Service members were slowly resuming their own conversations, though many were still processing what they had witnessed. Torres turned to his Marines, his bearing once again that of a confident and competent leader, but tempered now with a humility and openness that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Jackson, Martinez," he said, "we're going to talk about this more when we get back to the unit.
I want to make sure you both understand the lessons we learned today, and I want to hear your thoughts about how we can apply them to make our Marines better." Both young Marines nodded eagerly, clearly excited about the prospect of deeper discussions about leadership and professional development.
Chen picked up her tray from the table where she had left it what felt like hours earlier, though the entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 minutes. Her sandwich was cold now, but she was no longer particularly hungry anyway. As she prepared to leave for her briefing with Admiral Morrison, Torres called out to her one more time. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for the lesson, for the way you handled this, and for giving me the chance to be better."
Chen turned back to him with a genuine smile. "Thank you for being willing to learn, Sergeant."
That willingness to grow and change is what makes someone a true warrior, regardless of what branch they serve in or what they look like in uniform.
As she walked toward the cafeteria exit, Commander Sarah Chen reflected on the unexpected turn her lunch break had taken.
She had come in just wanting a quiet sandwich before her afternoon briefing. Instead, she had ended up delivering one of the most important lessons of her career to an audience she never expected to teach. The confrontation with Sergeant Torres would be discussed throughout Norfolk Naval Base for months to come, eventually becoming part of the informal leadership curriculum that senior enlisted and officers shared with their subordinates. The story would spread beyond the base, becoming legend within special operations communities as an example of how to handle prejudice and misconceptions with professionalism and grace. But perhaps most importantly, 3 Marines had learned lessons that day that would shape their approach to leadership and service for the rest of their careers. Sergeant Torres would become known throughout his remaining years of service as one of the most effective and open-minded leaders in his unit, always willing to challenge his own assumptions and learn from anyone who had knowledge to share. Corporals Jackson and Martinez would carry the memory of that day through their own advancement in the Marine Corps, eventually becoming senior leaders themselves who understood the importance of evaluating people based on their capabilities, rather than their appearance.
damage, injury, again being lost.
And Commander Sarah Chen would continue her service, leading the most elite warriors in the world while occasionally taking time to remind people that military excellence comes in all forms, and that the deadliest enemies are often the ones you least expect. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the cafeteria staff resumed their duties, and life at Norfolk Naval Base continued as normal. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation between a decorated Marine sergeant and a quiet woman who turned out to command Navy SEALs, normal would never quite look the same again. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or tactics, but with words and wisdom and the courage to challenge our own assumptions about what strength really looks like.